Welcome to our webinar on conducting remote user research. So I'm Lisa and I'm responsible for planning and setting up these events at Torchbox. And I'm always keen to hear any suggestions that you've got for topics and any feedback that you have as well. The session today is 60 minutes and we have quite a lot to get through, but we do encourage you to ask any questions that you've got using the chat or the Q&A function. And we're going to answer those at the end of the session rather than as we go. This is a webinar, so you can see us, but we can't see you, which is why we're asking you to say hello in the chat as well. And also for any questions that we don't get to, I will be sending a follow-up emails with answers to those questions, and I will share any resources that we've mentioned as well. Our speakers today that you can see here, we've got Ollie Willens, who is a co-founder of Torchbox and creative director.
Hey there.
And we've also got Luisa Frederico, and she is a UX consultant at Torchbox.
Hi, everyone.
So I think that's it for housekeeping stuff. So on that note, I will hand over to Ollie to get things going.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Welcome, everybody. Hope everybody is healthy and happy and safe in these times. So we're from Torchbox. We know some of you have seen people on the invite list and recognize some people who are introducing themselves. So hi everybody, we know quite a few of you. For you, Torchbox, our digital agency working primarily in the charity sector. We've been around 20 years. We've worked with many of the biggest and best charities in the UK. We do work in the public sector as well, including for the NHS, for example, and quite a bit in the States now as well. We're currently working with Mozilla, the University of Pennsylvania, and NASA as well, which is quite exciting. So on the design side of things, user research is the bedrock of user-centered design. And it doesn't need to fall by the wayside now that so many of us are working remotely. And I don't think it is. You know, talking to the user recruitment company that we tend to work with, the company called People for Research, their work has held up pretty well during these difficult times, but their state-of-the-art lab is sitting completely empty, and they are doing 90+% of their recruitment for online interviews and tests. And today we want to encourage you and hopefully help you a little bit to do more research yourselves remotely. We're going to keep it pretty varied by what we kind of term as research. We're going to talk a fair bit about user interviews and doing them, but we're also going to talk about co-designing prototypes with users and then testing those. So this is sometimes a pragmatic way of doing a kind of project-based development. So instead of doing a big research project at the beginning, create prototypes of your ideas, perhaps involving users in the design process, and then test them on users and have conversation with those people about them. And that can be a way to move things forward really quickly. And we're going to talk about user testing. Particularly, we're going to focus on remote automated user testing, which is a sort of user testing that people don't tend to do so much of. And then finally, we're going to talk about how we store and manage all the kind of loads of research that you end up pulling together in the different things that you do, different strands of work you do. So we're going to try and keep this kind of, we're going to try and keep to a sort of Q&A type of approach to try and keep it quite upbeat between me and Louisa, which I hope will make it fun to follow. There are 1 or 2 slides, not that many, and there's a chance to try out a test in the middle. And I think there are a couple of sort of templates that we've prepared that you can download at the end too, if you think you'll find them useful. So I think I'm going to start diving right in, and we're going to start off by talking just more broadly about the process. So to get us going, Louisa, most people imagine doing user research at the start of a design process, but we don't think it's just about that. Can you talk why that might be a missed opportunity, that perspective?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we really believe that, doing or building something without research is a form of gambling, really. This is why we see us using user research like across the entire design process. Usually from exploring problems, this is where people do most of their user research, but you should also do it when you're defining your solutions, when you're delivering, improving them. And the reason why we do this is to de-risk the process. We're ensuring that we're putting our bets on building the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just to introduce, you could just talk quickly about a couple of projects that we've done recently so people know the kind of projects that we do.
Yeah, so Ollie, you mentioned earlier, like the three kind of top things, so like interviews, co-creation, and user testing. For interviews, we did a really interesting project with Oxford City Council, but also with other councils around the UK, where we did a lot of user interviews, remote user interviews, to understand whether chatbots would or would not be a useful and valuable solution for helping councils to deliver their local services.
Yeah.
Turns out that in some cases they were, and in some cases there weren't. This is helping us build a business case towards something. In regards to co-creation, we did a really interesting project with the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and we were working on their membership sign-up experience. And we did co-creation with users to understand what their expectations were of that journey, which was really interesting and gave us better results. And with user testing, we did a really great project with Samaritans where we had some user insight, but we weren't quite sure how to move that forward. So we knew that people who are at risk of suicide and who are potentially wanting to call their phone line, some people have so much anxiety that they don't want to talk on the phone. So a chat service would have been a better thing. So we did a lot of user testing to finesse and get that solution right before it actually went live to market. And this is really important to do, especially when it might save lives. But as
Yeah.
you can see, like, ultimately, user research just helps us make better informed decisions across the entire design process. And it helps us to save money as well by making sure that we are building the right thing.
Yeah, I love that Samaritans project. So proud of that one. Yeah, saving money is important, I think, because sometimes people are kind of worried about research because of the amount of money it might cost and so on. There's a joke. How many UX designers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, first we need to be sure that a light bulb is the correct solution. So I suggest a research project to understand the role of light in society, and that kind of it's a funny one. It represents, the fact that sometimes, it can be a runaway thing, research. How much research do you actually need to do? And when do you know when you've done enough?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of really touched that nerve there because yeah, in my experience, like talking about research with people can sometimes really scare them, and especially when you're kind of talking to kind of people higher up or higher up executives or SMT. People automatically think that you need to spend loads of money on these really big reports that no one's ever going to read, but it really doesn't have to be the case.
No, absolutely. Um, uh, so, um, so if you don't write big reports, what do you do?
Well, I guess, like I said, the great thing is that you can do lots of little things and often, which is what I would definitely recommend that people do to give you just that validation and that evidence, like as you're going through the process. And ultimately, like you should only do research if it's helping you to get somewhere or make a decision. And that somewhere might be finding out that your idea was a bad idea, and that's okay. At least you're not building the bad idea. So I would definitely recommend reading this book. I have it here actually to show you guys. It's called Just Enough Research by Erica Hall. It's not very big at all, so it's worth having it. I keep it here with me as a point of reference. But you can see a bunch of her kind of videos online as well if you'd prefer to do that. But she really focuses on how research isn't just for researchers, and you can do little and often to help give you the answers that you need to inform your project.
That's great. Thank you. I think Lisa's just put the link to that into the chat if anybody's interested in that book. So let's get a bit more into the guts of it then and talk about how to get the most out of in-person remote interviews. So
Mm.
why do we do them to start off with?
Well, the value of doing interviews is to understand what and why people do what they do. And you can dig into things a lot more because you're having a dialogue, right? You're having a conversation with someone. This is very different to things like analytics, where you can see how people are behaving, but you don't understand why. It's just kind of giving
Yeah,
you that data. But ultimately, talking to people can inform the design of better products, better services, better experiences.
great. And what about doing them? Now we're doing them remotely. What's the impact of doing them remotely?
So it's interesting because we've actually been doing remote user research way before COVID, and we've been quite lucky in that sense because we've already been very set up to do this type of work. But I'm actually a really big fan of remote user interviews for a few reasons. Like, first of all, it's really cost effective. It means that you're not having to pay for anyone's travel, which is also, saving the planet and all that. But it's also more inclusive. It means that more people can take part in the interviews so long as they have a phone or a computer, and most people do, at least a phone. And it's easier to schedule, so you can fit around people's responsibilities. Like, don't forget that most people work or have families, especially now in lockdown. There's a lot going on in people's lives. People are having to juggle a lot. So sometimes they can only do evenings, and that's okay. Like, I've done loads of evening interviews, and it means you're doing them from the comfort of your own home.
Okay, that sounds like it sounds great. But what about downsides?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned computer or phone, and I think if you're doing interviews over the phone, it's great, you can access more people, but the big downside is that you can't read someone's facial expressions, their body language. You can learn so much by just little reactions to questions or what they're saying. So that's a big thing that you miss out on when you're doing things over the phone. But another thing is that people nowadays, especially, are way more concerned about data privacy. So one of the things you need to do is put way extra effort in giving people the reassurance and being really transparent in terms of the processes that you have in place to, like, how do you manage people's personal information. Um, Equally, people also aren't very tech savvy, or not everyone, but like there's still a lot of people who aren't. So doing things remotely means that you, as the interviewer or the facilitator, you have to put more efforts to handhold people, make sure people are familiar and comfortable with the tools that you're using. So yeah, the downside is a lot more handholding, but if you
Okay,
prep, then you can do that well.
okay. All right. So preparing. So what do you do in preparation? What tips have you got for people? What should they go through first?
Yeah, so in all the projects where we've done user research training with our clients, this is the bit that it really catches people by surprise because people underestimate the amount that it takes to do this properly. There's an Abraham Lincoln quote that says that, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I'll spend the first four sharpening the axe. And, it's very true. Like, it's all in the prep. And whilst research prep isn't a very sexy topic at all, but get this right and you're going to make your life so much easier and way less stressful.
Okay. So what's the first thing to prepare?
Well, the first thing that I would do is set up a form of research plan. And you should be asking yourself some key questions. So, what are the main questions that you're trying to answer? Like, what's the objective of the research? Who are you trying to learn from? How are you going to reach those people? And how long are the interviews? When will they take place? Like, what are those some of those like logistical questions of like when, what, where, how?
Okay. So you've started doing that planning. What about actually recruiting the users?
So recruitment can sometimes be quite tricky, but there's two ways you could go about this. You can talk to your existing user base, which is great. Usually it's easier to reach because you can send something in an email newsletter or reach people via your social media. And people are actually more willing to give up their time for free if they support your organization already, which is great. But if you want to talk to prospective users, then you're more likely to need a recruitment agency for that, because otherwise it's quite difficult to do that on your own. There's lots of agencies like that out there. We use people for research, as you mentioned. And usually the way that it works with using a recruitment agency, it's about a 2-week lead time between brief and finding the people. It's about 90 quid per head, plus, depending on how kind of specific you're being about who you want to reach. And on top of that, you need to pay an incentive as well. And best practice says that it's £1 per minute, which sometimes people are surprised about, but research shows that anything less than that, there's a risk that people won't show up.
Okay. So that's about 120 quid for a 30-minute interview per person.
Mhm.
Um, okay. That makes sense. But obviously, it's much cheaper if you're recruiting from your own user base because you don't pay the first 90, right? You just pay the 30 if you have to pay it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is, and that's definitely a plus side. But on the other hand, again, just don't underestimate how long it takes to organize your own recruitment. This is why a lot of organizations would just prefer to pay that out just to remove that stress. So There's a lot to do. You have to advertise the research activity itself and hope that people are interested. Once people start getting in touch with you or when you're contacting them, you need to then start screening the participants that you want. You need to confirm the activity details with them in terms of that back and forth of arranging times and availability, and also gaining consent ahead of the interview. And as you can imagine, once there's dozens, if not hundreds of people trying to get in touch about this, it can be a nightmare if you're not prepared.
Yeah.
But I mentioned scheduling though, and scheduling doesn't have to be an absolute nightmare. So there's a way that you can automate this. We've used things like youcanbook.me before, and other people have used like Calendarly. These are systems that can help you like set specific times that people can then select and self-assign that time. This will save you loads of time and
Yeah.
hassle in that back and forth.
It saves it's a nightmare otherwise. There's been we've got a question actually from the audience. Actually, someone submitted this beforehand, but I'll ask it now. It's from Jade O'Neill from National Ugly Mugs. She's asked, it would be helpful to get some advice on securing diverse user groups when conducting remote research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I mentioned the screening, and that's something that you can do in terms of asking specific questions when you're putting out, that kind of research adverts, by asking people maybe where they live in the country, what their age is. If you're interested in different like ethnic groups, you can definitely ask those questions. And what that does is that it helps you to not only recruit 18 to 25-year-olds in London, if you have a national base. So you can do some of that yourself. But also another thing to think about is the channel that you're using to recruit those people. So if you're only advertising on Twitter, bear in mind that maybe only a specific segment of your user base is following you on Twitter. So it's really important to think about all of these things if you're recruiting people yourself.
Yeah. What about remote testing with disabled users? We did something that was interesting recently, didn't we?
Yeah, and I thought it's good to talk about this because sometimes there's not enough engagement with users who are kind of like underrepresented in the design process. But we did some user testing with young deaf people for the National Deaf Children's Society, and we used Zoom for that. And Zoom has a closed caption tool, which is great. It means that if I'm doing this thing with for example, a young deaf person, we have a translator who can translate in the moment, typing in what I'm saying so that the user can understand what I'm saying and equally back to me. But this could be done with international users as well. So if you're interested in international audiences and you don't speak the language, you pay a bit more to have a translator, but the digital tools do help you in doing this.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say actually, a guy had a tip as well, which is that that user research recruitment agency, People for Research, have actually set up a couple of panels of disabled users as well. There's one in Bristol and there's one in London, but they all work remotely, and you can then do tests with people using, for example, screen readers or other assistive technologies. And it's quite difficult to sort that kind of stuff out yourself, because if you speak to somebody who's blind, for example, they not need only to be able to use a screen reader, but for it to be an effective remote test, they need to be able to set up Zoom to screen share their screen. So there's lots of barriers in the way of that. But the people on these panels can already do that stuff. And although you can't be very specific in the kind of demographic of people you recruit, you have to kind of use one of the people that's on the panel. For 80 quid a go, it's really good value and well worth considering. Okay, but what about scheduling? So we found our users. What about scheduling them? How many interviews would you schedule in a day?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think I would recommend about 4 to 5 at the very most if you want to stay sane. Definitely allow yourself your breaks because all of us know how tiring it is to kind of be on Zoom all day. So it's the same when you're doing interviews. So definitely give yourself a break. But yeah, we've also adopted a lean analysis method. And all this is that we've assigned, for example, an hour slot to do an interview. And immediately after, give yourself about half an hour to do a quick analysis of what just happened. Especially when you're doing it with a buddy, it's great when immediately after a meeting, the natural thing that would happen in the real world is that you leave the meeting and then you're both chatting about what just happened. And when you can do that as you're moving along, it means you save yourself so much time at the end. So imagine doing a whole week of interviews. By Friday afternoon, you're not going to remember what the first person said. So by doing that quick analysis, it means you don't have to spend the next week going through everything all over again. It's just moves you along a little bit quicker.
So do you normally do it with a buddy or on your own?
Like that's actually best practice is to have two people, but you can do it on your own, but it is a lot to take on, which is why we recommend having two people. With two people, there's a few things. Like one person can focus on the conversation and you can be really present and, be really involved. And one person can be taking notes. Not to say that the note taker has to be quiet, you can both interact, but then you have clearer roles like that. And the other thing is that people interpret things differently. So, especially with analysis, I might understand one thing from what I just heard, and my buddy will go, "Oh, didn't you pick up on this thing?" And as you know, as a team, you do get better outputs. But more than anything, it just takes the pressure off. Really, it will make things feel a little bit more enjoyable for you.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so you've got it all prepped. The day arrives of your interviews. Can you give people a few tips on how you try to make sure that you're being a great interviewer?
Yeah, sure. And I've prepped some slides here that I want to share with you, and I've used this before. But ultimately, there are multiple personalities that you need to have when you're doing these interviews, and it's very important to do this remotely as well. And which is there's so much to kind of take on. But the first thing is being the steward. Now, when you're the steward, you're having to make people feel welcome, comfortable, and this actually starts happening before the interview, especially when it's remotely. You have to spend so much more time making sure that people know what link they're going to be clicking on, where they have to be, that their setup is right, that their mic is working. Make sure you have internet, that they're not doing it in a cafe where you're not going to hear what they're saying. There's a lot to kind of take on here. The other thing is being neutral. So you like as the interviewer, like you don't want to make people feel like they're being judged. So if you want people to be honest and share all of their experiences with you, you just need to be as neutral a party as possible. The other one, which is really hard, and again, this is why it really starts helping to have two people rather than one, you also have to have someone playing the role of the scientist. The whole reason why you're talking to people is that you need to start spotting patterns and trends in the data that you're collecting. So you need to observe, listen very carefully, and do things methodically to make sure that you're kind of, capturing the data in the right way. And finally, you have the reporter. So you need to know how to ask the right questions to get the most value out of the session. You need to have a little bit of wiggle room because everyone reacts differently to questions that you ask. Some people talk more, some people talk less, but you need to know when to shut up. That's very important because you're asking people about their experience. So it's not about you, it's about what they have to say.
Great. So, what about a discussion guide? Do you do a script or a discussion guide, or how do you do that?
Yeah, so I think a discussion guide is preferable. A script can be a little bit too, prescriptive, but a discussion guide will help you go through that conversation and make sure that you're asking some of those kind of key questions to get that data right. But I would definitely say practice this with a colleague. Make sure that your timings are right. Otherwise, you might get yourself in that stressful situation of not having enough or having too much and you didn't get the answers that you wanted.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think if you're having an interview and something interesting comes up, you've got to be prepared to go off script and follow what might be a potentially interesting kind of
Mm.
line of inquiry. Okay, but if you're just starting out doing interviews, how do you know what the right questions are to ask?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's really tough if it's something that you haven't been doing for a while, and if it doesn't just come naturally. I would always recommend the jobs to be done methodology, and for anyone that hasn't heard of it, it's quite simple, really. You focus on past experiences. Because you can't really talk about hypotheticals. That's not a very good sense of what people might actually do. Past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So get someone to focus on something they did in the past 6 months, for example. Asking open-ended questions is a big one. Don't ask those closed yes or no questions. Make sure people can open up about their experiences. But by focusing on a task, tell me about the last time you made a single donation to a charity, or tell me about the last time you made a large purchase for your house. It kind of helps to open up and you're getting into that problem space a little bit more. I would definitely recommend, though, that for the jobs to be done stuff, and this is great. I would definitely recommend this stuff. It's a pack of cards that helps you how to learn how to interview customers. And this is great for a few reasons. Number one, if you're doing things remotely, even better, because you can have this pack of cards out in front of you on your desk, and it guides you through the types of questions that you can ask your users and even the things that you should not be doing. So it's really good because there's so many of these like pitfalls and things that we tend to just naturally get into, like communication pitfalls. So this pack is great as a way to just help you to like not make those kind of mistakes, and you're learning as you go through it as well.
And how long? How long for an interview on average?
I mean, some interviews can be done in half an hour. Some people are really chatty and they go for the whole hour. But I would say that on average, 45 minutes, but always plan for an hour. That you shouldn't really be talking to someone for longer than that. But ultimately, what I would say that what you want to try and get at the end is to understand a timeline of someone's experience and the factors that push them to behave in certain ways. But you know what? Like by talking to people, you can really understand things about their needs, expectations, but you can also learn a lot of that from involving people in the ideation process as well. So I wanted to kind of flip this around now and talk to you for a minute about co-creation or co-design. It's one of the things that I know is that you really like to do this. So can you make co-design work remotely?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's been a revelation to a lot of people actually how workshops and even creative workshops can work so well remotely. And I think some people, maybe it's true of us, have even found that these sort of sessions work even better remotely. What I would say, I think, is that this is the more difficult end of the stuff to do yourselves. If you don't have direct experience of it, sometimes it really helps to have maybe been in a workshop with an agency or something like that, so that you get a bit of a kind of introduction to it. But you can do it. There's a lot of online kind of educational tools to help with this stuff, and you can do this. And if you can create these kind of good co-design experiences remotely, they're very valuable.
And why would you say we found it easier to do it than face to face?
I think that it's a lot of it comes down to planning. It's kind of like how good your planning is depends how good your workshop is and how good the outputs are in many of the cases. And when you're running a remote workshop, I think it forces you to plan much more carefully. You really don't want things to go wrong. It's a nightmare if it goes things go wrong and you're not in the room. So you just plan more carefully, and the better the planning, the better the workshop. I think that's the main thing. I also think there's something about the structure of when everybody is remote. It's difficult when some people are remote and some people are in a kind of clump. But when everybody's remote, it makes for a very balanced sort of workshop where it's easy to get everybody inputting, which is nice. But there's also the rise of the kind of interactive whiteboard. Tools like Miro are really powerful, really help.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Miro, but like we mentioned earlier, people that aren't confident with technology, like what about them?
Yeah, that's tough, I think. I think, there's a point at which it's more difficult to get those people to interact in a workshop that is a group kind of conference call on Zoom with an interactive whiteboard in a browser window in which you're doing lots of timed, slightly pressurized exercises. Maybe you have to upload things, maybe you have to sketch things. Not everybody is comfortable using technology that flexibly, I don't think.
Yeah, and I guess, what do you do in that situation though?
I mean, the first thing you do is you check whether people can do it or not, and then you can coach them to do it a little bit. So, if it's an important workshop, you might have a preparatory call with somebody, and you kind of go through the tools and make sure they're comfortable with them. Some people, though, you're not going to get to that level, that sort of level that we're talking about. So, in that situation, you maybe you design a session that is less difficult. So, I see co-creation as a kind of broad approach, not a kind of specific couple of exercises. So if there's a continuum, at one end you might have that kind of Miro idea generation, prototype development stuff, and at the other end you might have some simpler exercises where people just write something down in text form. And there are kind of formats to make that easier. So I like the kind of letter from the future. So in that situation, if you're developing a product, you might ask people to describe the product that they're using 2 or 3 years down the line. What does it do? How does it work? What's the impact that it's had on the way a service is delivered? That sort of thing is much easier for people to kind of participate in. So it's a good option.
Yeah. And I mean, generally speaking, though, we do use Miro, right?
We do with most of the workshops that we do. Yeah. Yeah.
And generally speaking, like what is it that we really like about Miro?
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, it's pretty amazing actually, as a kind of browser-based app, what you can do in a web browser as an app these days. But yeah, it's great for idea generation, kind of sticky note stuff. It's great for voting. It's great for collecting stimulus to help brief people before an exercise. It's good for designing and drawing in the products. It's got prototyping tools. It's good for making kind of process flows or experience maps. So it's a powerful tool like that, and it's easy to get the hang of as well. And as a facilitator, it's a good tool as well. You can look over people's shoulders. You can bring everybody to a certain point in the board. You can lock stuff down. You can time exercises. There's lots you can do. And one of the things that we all love about it is that the kind of outputs are immediately digital, so you don't have to write stuff up.
Yeah, I mean, I must say that's one of my favorites because when you're doing like, real in-person workshops, you end up with thousands of post-its with people's really bad handwriting and you have to translate that and type it all up. So this is one of the great things of doing things remotely. It's already saved, it's already there.
Yeah.
You did say that it's good for designing and drawing and stuff in Miro, but do you get participants to actually design within Miro in workshops?
Generally, I like people to sketch on paper and pen if we're, paper and pen if we're doing a sketch output. I mean, Miro has these tools, and some of our team do co-design sessions with people using these tools. I wouldn't do it unless everybody's really experienced in using those tools. It's a difficult enough workshop as it is, and most people find sketching on a pen and paper with a pen and paper pretty easy, and then taking a photo with a mobile phone and uploading it is something that you can get most people to do easily. So that's the safe option, definitely.
Yeah, I guess it would just come a bit more naturally, wouldn't it? But yeah, so I guess in that case, I'm guessing you just give a brief to people and tell them to sketch something.
Yeah. So ideally, when you're doing a co-design workshop like this, you want to help people move sort of slowly towards the point at which they sketch solutions, so that ideas have a chance to form and kind of grow in their minds through that process. So an example of that is the 4-step sketching process from the Google Ventures Design Sprint book. So those 4 steps. First of all, you get your participants to start making notes about their ideas and all the different kind of things that they think are important and might come into their sketches. Then the next step is to get them to just do some preliminary doodles, kind of some preliminary sketches. You don't show anybody these. These are just to get you over the sort of starting to sketch barrier. And then in that process, you do crazy eights. So this is an exercise that some of you will know. When you fold a piece of A4 paper into 8 bits, and you have to do a separate sketch in each of the 8 sections of the bit of paper. The actual idea is that you do a variant of the same sketch, a different variant in each of the 8 boxes. So it's forcing your mind to kind of develop your ideas. That is super tough, actually. Even for like designers, that's really tough. So if you don't get 8, that's fine. Or even you can let people sketch different bits in the Crazy 8 format. If you have more time, I like it when you do the Crazy 8s and then you allow people to develop their 3 best sketches a bit further. That's quite interesting. But the 4th step in the design sprint process is the main 3-step sketch. So gather info, doodle ideas, do your Crazy 8, and then get to your main sketch. So you move people along that. I really like the content on this stuff, by the way, from the German agency AJ and Smart. They have evolved the Google Ventures design sprint process quite a bit and really well. I've done their online certification program, which is excellent. And they also have some good YouTube content. This is the guy who runs the agency. It's called Jonathan Courtney. And it's excellent teaching content on YouTube because it's fun to do as well as being really helpful.
Yeah, it's definitely something that feels like it can be a bit of a big leap, though, isn't it, for some people? So it's useful to have this kind of great educational stuff, like anything on YouTube, I think is a kind of a great resource. I guess like from, ultimately though, what is it that you hope to get out of the co-creation process with users?
Yeah, okay. I think that a couple of things. So, firstly, if people have got a lot of people have just got great ideas in them, you know, they're stakeholders or the users who've been kind of dealing with the situation for a while and been thinking, if only it worked like this. And that's what I want them to be able to get out, those good ideas that they've got kind of innately in them. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think you want diverse ideas. So you want to be able to capture ideas, different voices, different perspectives. That really helps the design team who might not kind of see those different perspectives originally. So having that kind of multiplicity and diversity of ideas is really useful. But sometimes, you know, you just don't get great ideas out of a co-design process, and it's okay. You know, it's, you know, you've probably got a design team who can do something decent anyway. So it's okay. It's not a disaster. And in fact, I think even without great ideas, it's a fantastic process. The people you involve in the process have a real sense of ownership and kind of commitment to what you're doing. So even if you don't get great results, it's a really great process.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine how, again, as a learning technique, even if the ideas or solutions that come from users aren't that great, the reason why they want those solutions, the benefits that they would give them, that's what you're learning from it, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But we should move on to talk about testing. So we've talked about kind of speaking to people to try and understand their kind of experiences. We've talked about coming up with ideas. We should talk about how to test those ideas. What do we learn from testing?
So there's a few things really. There you have these questions like, is this thing usable? Do users understand this thing? And can users complete certain tasks? Those are like the main things that you're trying to learn from testing. And it's important to note as well, by the way, that you might have other things that at your disposal, such as analytics or session recordings like Hotjar and stuff like that. And people behave really differently when they don't know that they're being observed. So this is a really important point because you can learn a lot from that sort of data, but you don't really understand why they're behaving in those ways, which is why then things like user testing and user interviews is really important. But definitely something to kind of keep in mind in terms of doing these things, like why are people behaving in this way.
Yeah, I love that. That's brilliant. Yeah, no, I mean, many ways the holy grail, I think, of that is testing. You know, in some ways, is watching people doing it, is field testing,
Mm.
as you might call it. But that's difficult to do at the moment. So we wanted to focus on talking about remote unmoderated testing. What's that?
So it sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but like you have moderated testing on one hand, where the interviewer is there to kind of ask the questions and you're hand holding someone through a test. You can intervene if they don't understand. And you do that more for like more in-depth things or to walk someone, like to understand someone's kind of full-on journey. But the unmoderated tests is when you set up a test and it goes live, and then that's your job done until the results start rolling in. And it's actually really gratifying when you're like, you set this up and you finish the working day by pushing out this test live, and then you come back the next morning and there's all these results already there. As a researcher, it makes me feel great because it's like all this stuff's coming in and I haven't had to do the work of kind of doing that.
Yeah.
But you do need to be mindful of the fact that it can take a while to go through the results.
Okay. So maybe I think you can show us an example of the sort of thing you're talking about, right?
Yeah, I'd love to. I actually set up a quick test on a website that we use called Usability Hub. And this is a great little platform that you can use to set up unmoderated tests. It only took me about 15 minutes to do this, and I'm going to send a link so that you can fill out this test for me. What I'm going to
Okay, so
do.
everything needs to be on it now. You're going to get a link and you get assigned a task.
Yeah, so I'm going to send you this on the chat. So let me send you here. And this should only take about a couple of minutes. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a little bit of music on in the background whilst we're doing that. So just let me know if it's too loud. Hopefully it's okay.
That's great.
Okay, I'll call you all back in a couple of minutes.
Okay, so we want everybody to do this test.
Yes, please.
one of the tests compares two stories. If you can't read them, you can zoom in on them. That was good. I've managed to have a go at that, Louise. That's great.
Thanks. I'll give everyone just another minute to do that.
Perfect. We had a question actually from somebody, didn't we, earlier, I think Gemma, about the issues in the past with no-shows for user testing and what's the best way to combat no-shows. This is a good question. I think that our no-show rate is probably about sort of 1 in 5 or 1 in 6, and we just work to expect that, really. So you've got to expect that. I mean, potentially you can have people who can step in, but for actual no-shows, that's really difficult. So you just have to plan a couple of extra interviews, I think, in the main. It does sort of depend how you manage the interviews, if there's incentives, if you can really trust the people, or if they come from an agency, they tend to be a little bit more reliable.
I would agree with that. Incentives are definitely a good way to do that. And that whole £1 per minute, giving less than that, there's stats that show that people are less likely to show up. So you do have to fork out a bit more for that. But if we want to speak to 5 people, we usually recruit 6, just in case one drops out. That's usually what we do. So great. Thank you very much for filling that out. I can see I've got already a few results. So what I want to do real quick with you now is I want to share my screen and I'm going to show you the results. So let me bring this up. All right, so you should see my screen now. And as you can see here, we've had 25 responses. And again, don't worry if any of you on the call didn't have a chance to finish. But when I asked people where would you click if you wanted to purchase this bundle of items, see here, a few of you clicked on the merchandise store. Some of you were clicking on an item itself. Quite a lot of you clicked on this bundle of love. So this heat map is great. It's a great way to visually show where people are clicking, but you can also click this little click map here. And this gives you the actual numbers, which is great. So this is a way of looking at these results. It's very visual, but ultimately, when you look at these preference tests down here, it's about 50-50 actually. It wasn't like you didn't have like a really clear winner. When stuff like this happens, it's really hard to make a decision if you were actually trying to do this again. You might have to run another test to get better results. But you can see here when I ask why you prefer this one, now I have no idea. It's a great comment. Looks more positive, etc. But as you have these qualitative answers, it takes you longer to analyze the results. So as you can see from like a few, if you have some percentages or if you have something visual here, like a click, like the heat map, it's quite a quick and easy way for you to get answers to your questions. So just bear this in mind if you're setting up these sorts of tests, that the more qualitative in nature, then the longer it will take you to analyze results when you're done with it.
And what about the number of people that you need to recruit for these types of tests?
Yeah, so I think that,
how do you recruit for them?
Well, there's 2 different ways really. Like the way that we did it here is that we set up a test that was under 2 minutes long, and we create a link that we can share. And by doing this, it's virtually free. It's only cost us like what, $2 or $3 to set up the test. But if you don't really have people to send to, you'd like to recruit people, Usability Hub does have a pool of users that you can recruit from. And you can use some sort of standard demographics to, to kind of segment your audience. So it can be things like what country they're from, gender, age range, even things like education level, technical proficiency, that sort of thing. But the downside of doing this is that you might be recruiting people who maybe have low brand engagements, or there's kind of an increased risk of having lower quality responses. So, but usually it works out about like $1 per participant if you do want to recruit them. So, it's worth doing if you're kind of struggling to find participants for sure.
Okay, but I think we generally find that it's better if you can send it to your own kind of if you can recruit your own people through your own lists and so on first. So how many people do you need though?
Well, there isn't really like a magic number. Different people tell you different things, but we'd say a minimum of 40 helps you spot clear trends in the data and accounts for outliers, stuff like that. But obviously, the more users you have, the more confidence you can have in your results.
Yeah, and the more difference there is in the, if it's a preference test like you saw there, if it was an A/B test, they would say that that wasn't statistically significant. So if it's a preference test, you know, if you've got 40 people and they all prefer this one, then you're in a good spot. If it's pretty mixed, then that's not going to give you a clear answer. Okay. Any final tips, Lisa, from you? Any final kind of words of wisdom on how to conduct good user testing sessions?
Yeah, I think if we focus on these unmoderated, then the setup is absolutely key. Again, it's all in the preparation. It's really frustrating when you send out a test and then you go back, you see the results, and you're like, oh no, people didn't understand my question, or people didn't really get it. So test your test. Do this with someone, do this with a buddy, with a colleague. Just make sure that people understand what the test is all about. But when it comes to moderated tests, a key thing for you to have really as a general mindset is patience. And I'll show you this just because it proves a point. When you're watching someone use your product or your prototype and they're not using it in the right way, it's so frustrating. And you just want to helicopter in and tell them, like, no, this is how it works, but that you should never do that. Like, watching someone fail miserably at using your product will teach you all the things that you should be improving or that you should be changing about your designs. So it's very important to keep that in mind.
Right. Okay, so there's one last thing that we wanted to talk about, which is about what to do with all this research that you're collecting, how you manage it. So there's a lot to keep track of. How do you organize all this stuff?
Sure. We've used things like Dovetail, Optimal Workshop. There's free stuff as well, like Notion, Airtable. But these softwares can help you keep all of your research in one place, helps you to group and analyze the data that you have, or communicate things with your team. I'll actually quickly show you this. This one here in particular is, I think, from Dovetail, and you can see how there's different types of user research from test interviews. It might be customer feedback that you have, but keeping it all in one place means that when you're opening up the information, you can tag that in different ways. So you can set this up. You can tag it by different types of features, or for example, different pain points that people have. It could be different services that your organization offers. And all of this means that the analysis of all of this is way easier. So, a lot of data to kind of go through and synthesize can be a bit of a nightmare. So it's good to use these things. And if you're doing a lot of it, I think it's definitely worth the money.
Yeah, and I think we need to point out that people need to make sure that it's GDPR compliant, that it's kind of that you've got solid data management practices, and especially if there's any personally identifiable information in any of that stuff.
Mm.
So what do you do with the research and insights in
Mm.
order to move it forward then? What do you do with all that
Yeah,
stuff?
so there's two things mainly. As we said, like we don't really want to be writing these massive long reports that no one's going to read. The purpose of doing research is to help you make decisions. So go from thinking to doing. We do this in the form of an opportunity backlog. So this is when you prioritize a set of opportunities based on the insights that you uncovered during your discovery phase. And you can communicate your insights to the broader organization as well. So again, research isn't just for researchers. Like your whole organization should understand your users and your supporters. So we do things like user journey maps. Like how can you visualize the process that someone goes through in order to complete a certain task or accomplish a goal? And by consolidating your insights into something visual, it's much easier to share it with people in other teams.
And finally, I think our final question for ourselves, I think, is how do you know what to act on and what not to act on? How do you prioritize that opportunity backlog?
Yeah, so I think this is when product strategy really comes into play. So product strategy can sometimes mean saying no to features. But if you do have to act on something, there's a few things you can think about. So does this fit in line with your vision and your objectives? Will this feature or this thing create meaningful engagement? And can we do this well? Can you scope and build it well? Is it technically feasible? Is it doable and practical? But ultimately, also beware of this frequently bias. People assume that when you hear things frequently or recently in research, it means that you should roadmap it into a thing, but that's not always the case. It is hard though, this, and I think realistically, product strategy or even user journey mapping, these could be webinars in their own right. There's some big can of worms we could open up, but if anyone is interested in knowing more about this, then please do let us know.
That's great. Thanks, Louise. That's really, really great. You sharing all that stuff with us. I think that's brilliant. Yeah. So, yeah, if you want to hear more about product strategy or user journey mapping, customer experience mapping, any of those things, then just make a note, and we might do something else about some of those subjects we've been thinking about. So, just there's a little bit of time for a couple of questions, I think. Hi, Lisa, you're back.
Hi. We've got a question from Yvette, and she's asked, how do you store recruitment or volunteer data to be able to search respondents by characteristics?
Okay, that's I think usually, again, that software that we showed you, things like Dovetail, for example, is a good place to kind of store information. But usually, depending on how you're capturing this information, a lot of organizations will have CRM systems where they're capturing this sort of data about their customer base. But if you're just looking somewhere to kind of keep track of the different sort of users and not just information about the user itself, but the interview or test feedback, something like Dovetail or Optimal Workshop even is a great way for you to save that information, but then also tag things so it's easier for you to refer back to it.
I think you can. I mean, a lot of this is this is sensitive data. This is the personally identifiable information stuff. So you have to be really careful about it. So you need to store it in a secure place, and you need to have whatever you're doing with it documented in as your documented process, and sticking to that process. I think so. If you have it in some sort of secure online spreadsheet thing that you're happy is GDPR client and is compliant, and you're happy is the hosting of that system is right, it's okay. But then you need to make sure that you delete all the kind of personally identifiable stuff in there as soon as possible. So we tend to do that for recruitment, and then we won't keep that stuff afterwards.
That's a really good point. Like when writing notes, we never keep writing people's names or contact details. We will probably just say like participant 1, participant 2. A good general rule is to not leave a breadcrumb of people's kind of names and information on things like potentially your phone, your email, software. So trying to minimize that as much as possible is a good rule of thumb.
Cool.
I've got one more question, I think, just really quickly, from Catherine at Think NPC. How do I ask questions that tell me what the most important features are to build?
This is an interesting one, isn't it? I think I mean, this is what we all want to do, is to sort of shortcut the kind of research and say, what's the answer? What do you want me to build? It's a tough one, this, I think. For me, I mean, Louise will give you her thoughts on this as well, but for me, I think this is difficult to do. So this is where sometimes prototyping something and testing it is a good way to go. If you've got a pretty good idea that something is going to work and you've got some reason to believe it's worth investing a bit in it, then if you prototype something and then test that on real people, maybe you even co-design it with those people, you test it on real people, that's a short way of getting a good kind of positive steer on some ideas.
I think another thing that's useful to do, if anyone's heard of the Kano model, it's understanding like what do people expect from an experience or a product, and what is it that people would like to have. So there's different ways that you can survey people and do things like top task analysis to really help to prioritize like what are the things that people value the most. So there are different ways of kind of going about that, but Ollie, you're absolutely right. Just testing something, and even if you can invest in like a Wizard of Oz sort of prototype where you put something live and it feels real, see if people in the real world would actually want to engage with or purchase something. You know, it might be that this thing isn't like up and running just yet. You have like, oh, thanks for showing interest, you know, not the best experience, but at least it helps you to test the concept to see if people will engage with it.
Great. I think we should wrap up there so people can get on to their next meetings. I hope people have enjoyed that. Thanks, Louisa. That was really great. I got you got a load of really valuable stuff there. If people could just drop in a note and see how they feel. Lisa, do you want to say something about following up?
The chat, well, I'll be sending an email out, a follow-up email with some of the links and things. And if you just have any feedback on the webinars, that would be great, because we're hosting them quite a lot and we can always keen to make them better.
Brilliant. Thanks everybody. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks everyone.